Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. And today's topic is the second half of our lecture on World War I. Now, before we begin, as always, take a moment, jot down the rest of the lecture outline, and pay particular attention to those key terms at the left. Let's get started. Now, like we said, we have workers, we have soldiers, but there's more to talk about. This was not a popular war. Remember, most soldiers had to be drafted. Now, just 8 days after the war, after we enter the war, Wilson issues an executive order establishing the Committee on Public Information. And basically, it was a propaganda campaign, a pro-war propaganda to convince the American people, using journalists, photographers, artists, and entertainers, to help sell the war to the American people. They would send out a group of 75,000 volunteers just to give 4-minute stump speeches to convince the American public this is a worthy cause. But while the war never becomes super popular, the propaganda had a negative consequence. Because it did work. It did build public opinion into a pro-war frenzy, even though they didn't really want to go to war. But the result of this was the demonization of anyone opposed to the war, that you're seeing as unpatriotic, and it leads to tremendous anti-German sentiment. When you're portraying your enemy as being vile, despicable, horrible, we need to go kill them and save democracy, well, who's your main enemy here? Germany. And so German Americans become vilified. In fact, it got so bad that symphonies refused to perform Bach and Beethoven, German composers. Schools stopped teaching German language as a foreign language option. And, hey, this is good. They started getting rid of German words from our lexicon, our language, our everyday language. For instance, sauerkraut. Now, I don't know about you, but I like sauerkraut. But you couldn't use that word anymore because that was a German word, so we started calling it Liberty cabbage. The German measles became known as Liberty measles. And of course, dachshunds, those cute little dogs, or dachshunds, yeah, those things, they became known as, you guessed it, Liberty pups. Yes, this is how silly it got, how extreme it got. And then this happens through almost every war. You create an enemy via propaganda, which stirs up animosity against Americans. And I'll give you a modern example. There was tremendous public outcry during the 2020 coronavirus outbreak because some people in the US government began calling it the Chinese virus or the Wuhan flu, or even more racistly, the Kung flu. Well, the problem with that is it's creating a negative depiction of an entire group of people based solely on their ethnicity or their race. And the result of that, and their studies show it, that during March, April, May, and so forth, that in the United States, Asian communities saw an uptick in racial violence, in racial hatred. And whether it's people visit the restaurants or people are just calling them names in the street, this is a tremendous problem. Which is why it's very important that even though, yes, the enemy here was Germany, you can't vilify all Germans under that umbrella. It got so bad that schools began removing German literature from libraries. They began burning German books. And German individuals were often also targeted. They risked being fired from their jobs, they may lose their businesses, and they became assaulted on the street. They got beat up by gangs and mobs. Some were even lynched. And so in response, German Americans had to hide their ethnic identity by changing their names, making sure they only spoke English all the time. And of course, this violence and hatred against Germany also fed into the suppression of any dissenting viewpoints. In fact, in 1917, we passed the Espionage Act. Now, the Espionage Act of 1917 set up a penalty of $10,000 and 20 years in prison for anyone who tries to incite insubordination, disloyalty, or refusal of duty in the armed forces, in other words, draft dodgers, or anyone who circulated false statements that were intended to interfere with the war effort. Wow. This is a huge net. Let me repeat this list to you. Insubordination, disloyalty, refusal of duty to the armed services, or who circulate false statements with the intent to interfere with the war effort. This was then strengthened in 1918 with the Sedition Act that extended the penalties to anyone who said, wrote, or printed anything that was, quote, disloyal, profane, or abusive to the American form of government, the Constitution, or the military. Wow. And I thought we had freedom of speech in this country. And funny enough, the Supreme Court upheld this. Supreme Court said, well, first of all, the Sedition Act back from 1798 was still in the books. And even though civil liberty groups thought that we had freedom of speech, Supreme Court ruled that this kind of speech that was abusive to the American form of government, the Constitution, the military during a war represented a, quote, clear and present danger, unquote, to the interests of the United States. Now, under the Alien and Sedition Acts, more than 1,000 convictions were had. And these are often people who, for moral reasons, were legitimately against the war. Generally speaking, socialists are actually pacifist. So they became a prime target. In socialism, socialists became a target of being very anti-American. In fact, Victor Berger, a socialist congressman from Milwaukee, received a 20-year sentence for writing an editorial that called the war a capitalist conspiracy. Now, whether you agree or not, 20 years? Seriously? I mean, I love the fact we live in a country where I can criticize the president. That's freedom of speech. But apparently you can't do that during times of war. Oh yeah, Eugene Debs, our old friend Eugene Debs, remember him? He urged young men to refuse service in the military. He said, quote, in all the history of the world, the master class has always declared the wars. The subject class, the peons, have always fought the battles. You need to know that you are good for something more than slavery and cannon fodder, unquote. He got a 10-year sentence in jail. And by the way, I told you in the last lecture, he will run for president in 1920 from jail while serving time for violating the Sedition Act. In other words, World War I was an unprecedented time of censorship and propaganda, along with the U.S. government exercising a dictatorship on the economy. But nonetheless, thanks to the United States' involvement in World War I, the Allies will prevail, and Germany will be defeated. And Wilson is going to try to impart his moral diplomacy on the end of the war. In January 1918, he will unveil a concrete program to end the war known as the 14 Points, something that you will probably all be reading for a future discussion board. Now, as the war is winding down, by late 1918, it's winding down. Now, it won't officially, by beginning of 1918, it's winding down. And by November, on the 11th day, in the 11th month, in the 11th hour, World War I will end. But this 14 points is going to be the guideline. And in this 14-point speech, this 14-point commitment, Woodrow Wilson outlines the way to heal the world and prevent a future war. Now, what he called for was a, quote, peace without victory. In other words, if you try to punish everyone who's at fault, all you're going to do is stoke animosity and create a future problem. So he wants to create peace without victory. And of course, Germany, who's going to be losing it here, loves this idea. Now, you'll read these 14 points yourself, but the first ones talk about self-determination. They talk about the end of the alliance system in a much more open world. He talks about global trade, talks about diplomacy, and again, you'll read about these yourself. But the 14th point was what he considered the most important point. The 14th point called for the establishment of an assembly in which all nations of the world will be represented and in which all international disputes will be given a fair hearing to find a peaceful solution. This was called the League of Nations. Now, so he wants to create an international body where all countries can come together and they can talk about their problems. Again, this is moral diplomacy and idealism. It sounds great. In theory, this would be all-encompassing. That would prevent any future war because the peer pressure of the global community will prevent one nation from open rebellion. And this idealism made him popular with the people. But as the world leaders gathered to negotiate the peace treaty, the Treaty of Versailles, he's going to be met with stiff resistance to his ideas. So here you see the big four here at Versailles. This includes David Lloyd George, Great Britain, George Clemenceau, France, and Victoriano Orlando of Italy, along with, of course, Woodrow Wilson on the far right. Notice who's not here. Germany. They're not invited to this peace negotiation because they're the loser. And the fact is, when they begin to negotiate the Treaty of Versailles, well, he promoted peace without victory. His counterparts in Europe, who have been suffering now for 4 years. Remember, the U.S. only got in a year ago. They've been suffering the fight on their home turf, on their homelands for 4 years. They have no interest in peace without victory. They want someone to pay. And of course, that's going to be Germany. Even though, remember, they weren't really the initial cause of this. During the negotiation, Wilson is forced to give up every one of his 14 points except number 14. And Wilson reasons it's enough. The League of Nations is the most important of his 14 points. As long as we can get that, we can prevent future wars. That's the plan. Oh, and they're going to stick it to Germany. So peace without victory is also out the window. And sure enough, they're going to stick Germany with a massive, what's called a reparation bill. Germany must pay a massive reparation bill for the cost of the war. Good luck, Germany, with your economy in the future. And basically, this right here is going to guarantee World War II, but we'll discuss that when we get to World War II. Huge problem, though, for Woodrow Wilson. He forgot something. Remember, he got what he wanted, at least something. He got the most important point of his 14 points. League of Nations. He got that. The world agrees, League of Nations, good thing. But Wilson made a critical blunder. Because Wilson's a Democrat, and Republicans controlled the House, controlled Congress. And he did not take a Republican with him to the Versailles Treaty negotiations. And the question then is, can Wilson unilaterally, executive power, put the United States in League of Nations? And the answer is no. Congress has to approve that. And he did not take Republicans with him to negotiate. Specifically, this man right here, Henry Cabot Lodge. Henry Cabot Lodge has extreme disdain for Woodrow Wilson. He doesn't like him at all. He's a senator from Massachusetts, and very smartly, he attacks the League of Nations on constitutionality. He says that the League of Nations, if the United States joins the League of Nations and there's a war somewhere, that the League of Nations will vote to send American troops to some far corner of the world and use U.S. troops to fight this war. In doing so is unconstitutional because the Constitution says only Congress can declare war and send troops. And you know what? He's right. Now, maybe it's not the greater good here, but he's right as far as the letter of the law of the Constitution. And therefore, despite Wilson traveling the country trying to drum up the American public in support of the League of Nations, the United States will never join the League of Nations, the very governing body, international community group that Wilson created. And as a result of our lack of participation, the League of Nations will be toothless. It'll be weak. It's worthless without them. And then, so Wilson is defeated. He lost every one of his 14 points because he never joins the League of Nations. And in 1920, Democrats will lose the election. But let's go back for a minute to post-war American society. Because that whole anti-German, hyper-patriotic, 100% Americanism campaign of the war continues after the war due to a number of things, including something you all might have heard of recently, the Spanish flu. Just as the war was winding down in 1918, a pandemic swept the world. The Spanish flu will rip across the globe, killing nearly 50 million people over the next 2 years. Here in the United States, it was actually met with a very similar attitude of the coronavirus of 2020. It was treated as a foreign disease, again called Spanish flu. It was believed to be brought back by soldiers, which wasn't fully the case. And it received varied responses by both the federal, state, and local governments. For example, some cities quarantined. Some, for instance, there was a great article recently about showing the comparison between Pittsburgh and St. Louis. Pittsburgh and St. Louis both quarantined for a short time. And then Pittsburgh decided to reopen because, hey, they flattened the curve and they had a new outbreak. Whereas St. Louis quarantined for longer and was able to prevent a second spike. And yes, guess what? There were also mandatory things like don't spit on sidewalks. That spreads disease. Apparently that's a big problem back in 1980, spit on sidewalks. You know, it's Department of Public Health prohibits spit on sidewalks. Notice the top left here. Theaters, schools, and churches have been closed. So anyone that tells you the government's never shut down churches in our history, they're wrong. Oh, and guess what? There were actually mask mandates as well. Okay, here's the comparison between Philadelphia and St. Louis here about the issue where Philadelphia spiked because they were reopened too soon. They didn't heed the warnings of experts, and they reopened. Versus St. Louis, as soon as the first cases were reported, they were able to contain the spread by quarantining immediately, thus fewer deaths. There was actually anti-maskers out there back in 1918 and 1919 as well. Because they felt that, screw that, I have choice. I'm not wearing a mask. The problem is masks are a public health issue. Again, certain individual liberties can be restricted for the greater good. That is part of American history. Because these anti-maskers believed that this was an infringement upon their individual rights, despite the fact that there were laws about no shirt, no shoes, no service as public health issues. But masks apparently are a big deal. Not only were we dealing with the Spanish flu, we were also facing a tremendous issue of anti-communism. Because in the Russian Revolution 1917, Vladimir Lenin takes over Russia, pulls them out of World War I. Yeah, that's a big problem. Because the American government is now increasingly concerned about the proliferation of radical political ideologies like communism. And many Americans look at Russia, they worry what's going on there, they fear it might lead to a similar revolution here in the United States. And thus, political ideologies that were considered radical or un-American were targeted, like anarchism, communism, and even socialism. And because communism and socialists tend to support American labor unions, there was a tremendous anti-labor backlash after the war. And yes, this is literally Uncle Sam spanking the labor union. Because after the war, prices continued to rise. And workers said, well, we're having a booming economy here. Why are we not getting increased wages? Like, we supported the war effort, but why are we not getting higher wages now? And all this pent-up anger after World War I unleashed itself in 1919 as more than 4 million workers went on strike. But they were branded as communists and radicals, thanks in part to the Russian Revolution and Vladimir Lenin. And thus Wilson viewed these activities as un-American and subversive. So much for him being progressive and supporting worker rights and busting up trusts, right? He busted up trusts, but doesn't help the American worker. And sometimes he even forced the workers back to work via gunpoint. But we're not done with communism yet, because as these radical ideologies spread to the increased publicity, the violence also increased. So much so that some were afraid that they were going to start using anarchist tactics to overthrow the US government and install communism, possibly. This led to what's called the First Red Scare. You see, between 1917 and 1921, we had what's called the First Red Scare, which means there will be a second one also, that means. And in 1917, 1921, the Attorney General, A. Mitchell Palmer, right there, and his young protege, J. Edgar Hoover, future leader of the FBI. The A. Mitchell Palmer was the Attorney General, and he had an extremely harsh stance against immigrants, labor radicalism, and, in general, communism. And he became a very popular target of hatred by labor organizers and anarchists. So much so that someone detonated a bomb on his front porch. And so Palmer used the FBI to initiate what became known as the Palmer Raids. Now, the Palmer Raids were these attempts by the US government to arrest and deport far left-wing radicals, especially anarchists, communists, and immigrants. So what were the Palmer Raids now? The Palmer Raids A. Mitchell Palmer used illegal searches and seizures, unwarranted arrests, and detentions to target radicals, communists, and anarchists. In fact, on New Year's Day 1920, federal agents, the FBI, broke into the homes and meeting places of thousands of suspected revolutionaries, in over 33 cities across the country. Coordinated effort meant to expose just how extreme the level of conspiracy, revolutionary, and anarchism that exists in the United States. Here they all rounded up, ready for deportation. Over 4,000 people were arrested and kept in jail for weeks without being charged with a crime, which is, by the way, a violation of the Constitution. Oh, fun fact, the federal government, the feds, only found a handful of guns, no rifles, no explosives. They were searching for these radical revolutionaries who were overthrow the government. Arrested 4,000 people illegally, and they only found a handful of guns, no rifles, no explosives. In the end, 556 people were deported on these raids. Now, the ultimate conclusion here is that Palmer had obviously exaggerated the internal threat of radicalism in America. That part's true. Which, by the way, this is a theme that will recur during the 1950s with the Second Red Scare. And it will also recur again post 9/11 in the 20th and 21st century with the terrorist scare, right? But this illustrates this widespread fear of radicalism and immigrant communities in the post-war period, and underscores that extreme racial, ethnic, and class divide that existed in America. Speaking of race, remember all those African Americans who went north during the Great Migration? And how many of those in other areas just moved off the farms into factory work or other types of work besides farm work? Yeah. Do you think those whites were happy to have African Americans now competing for jobs? Nope, not at all. And in fact, during 1919, there was a race riot in Chicago, killing 38 people, injuring 537 more. Right here in Texas, in the city of Longview in 1919, local whites invaded a black section of Longview, Texas. They burned the shops and houses and ran several African Americans out of town. Now, if you're paying attention, in the summer of 2020, Donald Trump was going to host a rally in Tulsa, Oklahoma. This is 1921, not 1919. But in 1920, there would be a massive attack, lynching, violence against what was called Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma, because the black community there was thriving. Economically speaking, they were doing better than many whites were. And therefore, as a protest against African Americans, the whites raided Black Wall Street and they began to loot and burn all the black businesses. And of course, the big outcry of Donald Trump having his rally there was that he was doing it in Tulsa, site of this Black Wall Street massacre, riot, and on Juneteenth, the traditional day of celebration of the liberation of slavery in the United States. And so, as you can see by the map in the right corner there, we have racial violence across our country. And while you would think it'd be more in the north because of the Great Migration, it's everywhere. We see major race riots and lynching. Again, there is tremendous unrest between race riots, labor activism, the Palmer raids, the Russian Revolution. Things are very chaotic post-World War I. But don't worry, 1920s are coming, and things will get back to a little more normal here. At least that's the promise of our president. But until then, take care, and bye-bye.